The lecture hall at Harvard was the kind of room that could make even the boldest students shrink. High ceilings arched above, carved oak panels glowed beneath the dim light, and rows of polished wooden desks gleamed like mirrors. It was late evening, the hour when most students had already drifted off to dinner parties, club meetings, or study groups. Yet here in this room, history was about to be written in silence. The front rows were filled with the self-proclaimed best students of Harvard, the polished elite, dressed in tailored blazers and expensive watches that ticked louder than their confidence. They carried their brilliance like a badge, flaunting it with the same ease they flaunted their last names. They weren't just students. They were heirs to senators, CEOs, and dynasties. Every smirk, every careless laugh carried an arrogance born not from struggle, but from the certainty that the world was theirs to inherit. At the very edge of the room, almost swallowed by shadow, sat Kesha Monroe. Her hair was pulled back in a simple braid, her sweater slightly worn at the sleeves. The faint squeak of her old sneakers echoed against the marble floor when she'd entered earlier, earning her a few side glances and hushed giggles. She had chosen the corner seat not to hide, but because she had learned long ago that the edges gave you a better view of the whole picture. And right now she was watching, observing, waiting. Professor Williams stepped forward, chalk in hand. His reputation was legendary, the kind of name whispered in libraries and study halls. Tonight, however, he wasn't delivering a lecture. Instead, he turned to the blackboard and wrote a single problem. Each number, each symbol, scratched into the slate with deliberate weight, filling the silence with a kind of prophecy. When he stepped back, the problem stood there like a mountain. "This," he said, turning to face the room, "is unsolvable, or so the world has claimed for 50 years. Tonight, I'm curious. Which of you will dare to climb it?" The room erupted in whispers. The best students leaned back in their chairs, some with bored expressions, others smirking like they had already conquered it. One boy with slicked back hair laughed under his breath. "Unsolvable? Then why waste our time?" Another tapped on his phone, sending a quick text before leaning over to his friend. "Bet the scholarship kid tries." Kesha heard it. She always heard it. Every jab, every whisper, it stuck to her skin like dust. But she kept her eyes on the problem, tracing the symbols with her gaze, her pencil already rolling between her fingers. Professor Williams waited. His eyes moved across the rows, watching, testing. But the polished heirs weren't built for this kind of battle. One by one, they shrugged, closed their notebooks, and began to stand. A girl with pearl earrings muttered, "I have better things to do." Another boy stretched and yawned, his expensive cologne trailing behind him as he left. The sound of footsteps echoed as the exodus began. Laughter trailed into the hallway. Chairs scraped. Confidence dissolved into apathy. Soon the great hall, once filled with chatter, sank into a heavy silence. Only the scratching of the chalk on the board remained, glowing like a challenge in the dim light. Professor Williams folded his arms, almost disappointed. "No one?" he asked softly, scanning the room again. The silence was suffocating. And then, a single hand rose from the shadows. Small, steady, and defiant. Every head turned. It was Kesha Monroe. Her voice was calm, but it carried through the cavernous room like a promise. "I'll try." The air shifted. You could feel it. The weight of centuries of privilege, arrogance, and silence collapsed into that one fragile moment. A girl, overlooked. The professor's eyes lingered on her hand, and for the first time that night, a faint smile touched his face. The story had just begun. The whispers began before Kesha even left the lecture hall. It started as a low hiss in the back row, a cruel chuckle disguised as conversation. By the time she had gathered her notebook and tucked the pencil into her bag, the best students had already retreated to their private world of smirks and mockery. They didn't dare say it aloud in front of the professor, but as soon as the heavy doors shut behind them, the knives came out. Down the hallway, in the soft glow of the chandeliers, a group of them huddled together. Tailored coats draped over their shoulders, the scent of designer perfume and arrogance thick in the air. A tall boy with sharp cheekbones pulled out his phone. "Let's make a group," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "We'll call it the Comedy Hour, because that's what this is going to be." The others laughed. Notifications buzzed as the group was created, a WhatsApp chat named Comedy Hour. Photos of Kesha's worn sneakers and frayed sweater sleeves were uploaded within minutes. A meme of a stick figure trying to climb a mountain appeared, labeled Harvard's New Hope. Messages poured in. "Quota kid thinks she's Einstein. Wait till she cracks under pressure. Does the maid know her daughter's playing pretend?" The laughter was easy for them. For Kesha, the cruelty would arrive differently. Small notes slipped under her dorm door, cold shoulders in study halls, the constant reminder that she did not belong. That night she sat at her tiny desk in her shared dorm room, the faint hum of laughter echoing from the hallway outside. Her roommate was out with friends Kesha was never invited to join. She spread her papers out, tracing the professor's problem over and over, her pencil scratching furiously. Against the page, the symbols blurred, her hand trembled, but she refused to stop. Her phone buzzed. It was her mother. "Hey, baby," Mrs. Shirley's voice came through, tired but warm. She had just finished her shift at the diner. "You still up studying?" Kesha hesitated. She didn't want her mother to hear the ache in her chest. "Yeah," she whispered. "I'm working on something important." Her mother chuckled softly. "Something important? Girl, everything you've done since you were 5 has been important. Remember when you used to count pennies on the kitchen floor and tell me we were rich if we had $1.25? You've been solving problems longer than they've been laughing at you." The words wrapped around her like a blanket. For a moment, the sting of the day dulled. She closed her eyes, imagining her mother's hands, rough from years of work, steady as they pressed her hair into braids every Sunday morning. "Just promise me one thing," her mother said after a pause. "Don't let them decide how far you can go. They don't know you. They don't know what you carry." Kesha nodded, though her mother couldn't see her. "I promise." When the call ended, the silence returned, but it wasn't empty anymore. She pulled a sticky note from her drawer, scrawled 3 words in bold letters, and slapped it above her desk. "Stand up anyway." The night stretched on. Midnight passed. One by one, the library lights across campus went dark, but Kesha's desk lamp burned like a stubborn star. She copied the problem again, this time slower, more deliberate. The equations weren't just numbers, they were walls, and she was going to find the cracks. Outside her dorm window, Harvard slept. Inside, a girl no one believed in was quietly sharpening her mind into a weapon. She didn't know it yet, but every cruel message, every laugh behind her back, every note slipped under her door was not breaking her. It was building her foundation, and when she stood again, they would all feel the quake. The library was nearly empty that night, its tall windows reflecting the moonlight like watchful eyes. The air smelled faintly of dust and old paper, a kind of sacred quiet that only deepened as the clock neared 2 in the morning. Most students had long since given up on studying, their laughter and footsteps fading into the distant dorms. But Kesha Monroe was still there, hunched over a table buried in notes, her pencil smudging graphite into streaks across the margins. Her eyes burned from exhaustion, but she wouldn't stop. She had copied the problem at least a dozen times, chasing threads of logic that seemed to unravel just when she thought she had something. Each failed attempt pressed heavier against her chest, but quitting wasn't an option, not for her. Across the room, a soft shuffle of shoes echoed. She didn't look up. Students often passed through the library at odd hours, but these steps didn't fade. They drew closer, steady, unhurried. Finally, a quiet voice broke the silence. "You've been at this for hours." Kesha glanced up, startled. Standing in the dim light of the lamp was Professor Wright. His presence carried a calm authority, different from Williams's sharp precision. Wright was older, his hair streaked with gray, his suit slightly wrinkled as if he had been living in books rather than in offices. His eyes, though, were alive, deep, thoughtful, and unblinking. She straightened quickly, embarrassed. "Professor Wright, I didn't realize anyone else was here." He nodded toward the chair across from her. "Mind if I sit?" She hesitated, then gestured with a small wave. He lowered himself into the chair, his movements deliberate, as though every gesture carried weight. For a long moment he didn't speak, only studied the scattered pages before her, equations half-formed, arrows crisscrossing the margins, tiny notes in her neat handwriting. "You're chasing it from the wrong angle," he finally said, tapping the pencil resting by her notebook. Her stomach tightened. "I know, I've tried a dozen different paths, but you're still treating it like their problem," he interrupted gently. "Not yours." She blinked at him. "Their problem?" Wright leaned back, folding his hands. "The students who walked out, they saw the board and tried to force it into a box they understood. But this isn't just about formulas, it's about perspective. You're letting their laughter sit in your head while you work. And that's a mistake." She dropped her gaze, shame burning at the edges of her eyes. He wasn't wrong. The echoes of their voices, quota kid, charity case, maid's daughter, were louder than the numbers sometimes. Wright reached into his jacket and pulled out a fountain pen. It gleamed faintly under the lamp, old but polished, the kind of pen that carried history in its weight. He set it gently on her notebook. "Use this," he said. "Not because it will solve the problem for you, but because every line you write with it will remind you that your voice belongs here. You've already paid your dues in ways those children couldn't imagine. Her throat tightened. She picked up the pen, feeling its unexpected heaviness. It was cool at first, then warm in her hand. Something about it felt like a passing of the torch. "Professor," she whispered, "do you really think I can do this?" He smiled faintly. "I don't think. I know. You've lived equations they've only ever read in books." The words sank deep, heavier than the pen in her hand, heavier than the silence of the library. For the first time in days, the ache in her chest eased. She wasn't just fighting to prove them wrong, she was fighting to prove herself right. As Wright stood to leave, his footsteps fading into the distance, Kesha bent back over her notebook. She pressed to Ra's shots. He fountain penned to paper, and the ink flowed like a current, steady and bold. The problem hadn't changed, but she had. And in that moment, alone in the midnight hush, Kesha Monroe began to see the first glimmer of a path no one else could walk. By the time the leaves outside Harvard Yard had turned to shades of crimson and gold, the whispers had grown sharper, heavier, impossible to ignore. The best students had their own universe. Late-night parties at Beacon Hill townhouses, brunches in Back Bay cafes, quiet confidence that every door in life would open before they even knocked. And then there was Kesha Monroe, walking across campus with a backpack that had lost one strap, notebooks full of scribbles, and a determination they mistook for desperation. The problem she had dared to claim lingered over her like a storm. People talked. At first, it was amusement. She thinks she's still working on that? But when weeks passed and she still hadn't given up, the tone shifted. The smirks turned into irritation, as if her persistence itself was an insult to their collective arrogance. The WhatsApp group thrived in secret. Late-night posts mocked her handwriting, her quiet presence in the library, even the second-hand clothes she wore. Screenshots bounced back and forth. One boy had snapped a photo of her dozing off over her notes, head resting on her arm. The caption read, "Future Nobel Prize winner, or just tired of sweeping floors?" The message earned 20 laughing emojis. Kesha didn't see it, at least not at first. What she did see were the consequences. Whispered chuckles when she entered a classroom, sudden silences when she walked past, a note taped to her dorm door with 2 words scrawled in black marker, "Know your place." One night, her laptop chimed. An email had arrived, not meant for her. Someone in the group had hit the wrong button. Her eyes scanned the thread. Line after line, joke after joke, her name twisted into cruel punchlines. Her throat closed, her chest tightened. He wanted to close it, delete it, pretend she hadn't seen. But she couldn't. Her hands shook as she scrolled. They had written about her mother. They had called her family the help, had mocked the diner uniform her mother wore every night to keep food on their table. That cut deeper than any insult aimed at her. She pressed the laptop shut and sat in the dark, the silence pressing in until it felt unbearable. For the first time since raising her hand in that lecture hall, Kesha felt the weight of the decision crush her. Who was she to think she could solve something generations of scholars had failed to touch? Who was she to stand against the tide of names, legacies, and wealth? Her eyes blurred with tears, hot and relentless. She wanted to quit. She wanted to walk away, just like they all expected her to. The problem wasn't just numbers anymore, it was survival. It was carrying her mother's tired hands, her own exhaustion, the humiliation of being the punchline of a cruel joke. But then her gaze lifted. Above her desk, taped crookedly on the wall, the sticky note she had written weeks before stared back at her. "Stand up anyway." Her tears slowed, her chest still ached, but her hands steadied. Slowly, she pulled her laptop back open. She read every cruel message again. This time not as wounds, but as fuel. She copied them, printed them one by one, until a stack of pages lay on her desk like evidence in a trial. She didn't know why, not yet, but something in her gut told her, "Don't throw them away, not yet." Kesha pushed the stack aside, opened her notebook, and uncapped the fountain pen Professor Wright had given her. The ink glided across the paper, bold and certain. The pain was still there, raw and sharp, but it no longer silenced her. She whispered into the quiet room, as though speaking to herself, to her mother, to every ghost of doubt. "You don't get to." The campus was wrapped in silence when Kesha stepped into the library at 3 a.m. The October air outside had been sharp, cutting against her skin, but inside, the warmth of old radiators hummed faintly beneath the weight of centuries of books. The lamps glowed low, casting amber pools of light across long tables. Empty chairs stretched endlessly, as though generations of ghosts were still bent over their studies. Kesha slid into her usual corner, dropping her backpack beside her. She pulled out the stack of notes, the copied equations, the cruel messages she had printed and shoved into a folder. They sat there like a shadow at the edge of her vision. She ignored them for now. Tonight, she wasn't chasing laughter or running from shame. Tonight, she wanted clarity. She uncapped the fountain pen and pressed it to a clean page. Ink flowed smoothly, dark and certain. She copied the problem again, but slower this time, almost reverently. Each symbol carved into the page like it was alive. Her mind was tired, but her heart was steady. Hours slipped by unnoticed. At some point, she leaned back, rubbing her temples. The numbers swam before her eyes, mocking her. "What am I missing?" she whispered into the silence. Her thoughts drifted back to her mother, to the nights they'd sat at their kitchen table, bills spread out, her mother stretching $20 to last a week, to the way she'd joke, "It's just math, baby. You shift things here, sacrifice there, and somehow we make it through." Kesha froze. The words replayed in her head. Shift things, sacrifice, make it through. Her eyes widened. She bent over the problem again, tracing the equations with her finger. They weren't incomplete because of error. They were incomplete because the model itself ignored resilience. She whispered the word aloud. Resilience. Her pulse quickened. She pulled the printed ends. Alts closer, her eyes darting across the pages. Quote a kid, maid's daughter, doesn't belong. They had been trying to break her, but in their cruelty, they had pointed her toward the missing piece. Resilience wasn't abstract. It was lived. It was survival in the face of scarcity, humiliation, and exclusion. It was her mother working 2 jobs without collapsing. It was her own decision to stay seated when the room had emptied. She grabbed a new sheet of paper. Her pen moved fast, almost too fast to keep up with her thoughts. She began building a model, not one born from privilege, but from necessity. She mapped resilience as a variable, each line capturing how survival adapts under pressure. The equations unfolded like a story, bending and reshaping until suddenly, beautifully, they clicked. Her breath caught. She sat frozen, staring at the page. The impossible problem wasn't impossible. It had only been invisible to those who never had to live inside it. She laughed, soft at first, then louder, her voice echoing against the high ceilings. For the first time in weeks, it wasn't bitter or forced, it was release. Kesha leaned back, tears pricking her eyes. She wasn't finished yet. The work ahead would be brutal, refining and proving every line. But the breakthrough was real. She pressed her hand over the notebook as if to protect it. "I found you," she whispered. The library swallowed her words, but they felt carved into the night itself. At dawn, when the first light spilled across the yard, Kesha was still there, her head bowed over the pages, ink staining her fingers. The problem had shifted. The silence had shifted. The lecture hall was alive that morning, buzzing louder than it ever had. Word had spread across campus like fire. Students who had never set foot in Professor Williams' class now crowded into the aisles, perching on steps, whispering into their phones. A few even recorded the scene, eager to capture what they believed would be a humiliating spectacle. Kesha Monroe stood just outside the heavy wooden doors, her hands pressed against the straps of her worn backpack. Her pulse throbbed at her temples. She could hear the chatter from inside, snickers, anticipation, the restless shifting of bodies. "They're waiting for you to fall," she whispered to herself. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Don't let them decide how far you can go." She inhaled sharply and pushed the doors open. The noise faltered as she stepped into the room. All eyes swung toward her. Some smirked, some frowned. A few pairs of eyes, sharp with disdain, watched her like hawks circling prey. The best students sat in the front rows, polished and perfect, leaning back in their seats with folded arms as though they were about to witness a comedy show. Professor Williams stood at the podium, his expression unreadable. He gestured toward the board. "Miss Monroe, the floor is yours." Her legs felt like lead as she walked down the aisle. The sound of her sneakers against the marble floor was deafening. She reached the front, set down her notebook, and uncapped the fountain pen Professor Wright had given her. Its weight steadied her. For a moment, the silence pressed in. Doubt clawed at her chest. Then she remembered the night in the library, the moment the equations had unfolded like a secret whispered just to her. The memory sparked, and she began. At first, her voice trembled. She wrote the original problem on the board carefully, each symbol chalking itself into existence beneath her hand. S. He turned to face them. "This equation has been called impossible for 50 years. But the truth is, it wasn't impossible. It was incomplete." Laughter broke from the front row. A boy in a navy blazer muttered loudly, "Here we go." His friends chuckled. Kesha ignored them. She turned back to the board and began to write again, slower this time, building her model step by step. Her voice grew steadier with every line. The model failed because it assumed stability, but life doesn't work like that. Systems collapse, people adjust. What's missing is resilience, the ability to adapt under pressure. The laughter quieted. Pencils stopped tapping. Students leaned forward. She pulled a page from her folder and pinned it beside the board. It wasn't equations this time. It was one of the cruel messages they had sent, printed in bold. Gasps rippled through the room. "You called me a maid's daughter," she said, her voice clear now, almost fierce. "You meant it as an insult, but that's exactly the point. Resilience lives in the places you don't look. It lives in the families who survive on scraps, the people who turn $1 into 10, the children who study by streetlight. It's not weakness, it's strength, and it's measurable." Her hand moved quickly, equations unfolding across the board like music. Each insult became a data point, each sneer repurposed into a line of proof. The model took shape, undeniable and precise. By the time she set the chalk down, the lecture hall was silent. She turned back to them, her chest rising and falling. For the first time, she wasn't shrinking beneath their gaze. She was meeting it. Professor Williams's jaw was tight. He stared at the board for a long time, his eyes narrowing, scanning each step. Finally, he looked back at her. "You're saying the unsolvable is solved?" Kesha lifted her chin. "I'm saying it was never unsolvable. It was invisible because no one like me was ever given the chance to stand here." The silence broke. Applause erupted from the back rows, hesitant at first, then louder, rolling forward like thunder. Some students stood, others clapped reluctantly. The best students sat frozen, their smirks wiped clean. Kesha didn't smile. She didn't need to. She simply gathered her notebook, capped the fountain pen, and walked back up the aisle as the sound of applause followed her. The girl they had mocked was no longer invisible, and the problem that had mocked the world for 50 years now had a solution. The applause still echoed in Kesha's ears long after she left the lecture hall. For the first time since arriving at Harvard, she felt the weight on her chest ease, even if just a little. But victories at this university rarely came without backlash, and hers was no exception. By the next morning, the campus was buzzing. The story spread fast. The quiet scholarship girl had stood in front of Harvard's elite and dismantled an impossible problem. Some whispered it with awe. Others repeated it with bitterness, as though it were an affront to the natural order. The best students weren't used to being overshadowed, least of all by someone they had spent weeks ridiculing. The group chat lit up with rage. "She embarrassed us. She made us look stupid in front of the whole school. We can't let this stand." Screenshots flew, plans formed, and soon the cruel whispers returned, sharper than before. Only this time, Kesha wasn't powerless. She had something they didn't know, something she had been quietly collecting. It happened 2 days later. Professor Williams announced that Kesha would be presenting her model again, this time at a special symposium. Faculty, alumni, and visiting scholars would attend. The news was met with a mix of applause and side-eyed resentment. The best students doubled their efforts, convinced they could expose her as a fraud in front of everyone. The evening of the symposium, Kesha walked into the grand hall, her notebook tucked under her arm. She wore the same sweater she had worn that first night in the lecture hall, its sleeves still slightly frayed. She hadn't changed her clothes, her shoes, or her quiet demeanor. The only thing that had changed was the fire in her eyes. The room filled with whispers as she took the stage. She felt the familiar knot of nerves tighten in her stomach, but she reminded herself of her mother's voice. "They don't know what you carry." She began her presentation with steady confidence, building her model step by step. The board filled with equations, each line drawn with certainty. But then, just as she had planned, she paused. "I need to explain something before I continue," she said, turning to face the crowd. "This model didn't come to me in a vacuum. It was forged in fire." She reached into her bag and pulled out the folder. Dozens of pages, each printed with the messages she had received. Gasps rippled through the room as she pinned them one by one to the board. The words were cruel, unmistakable, and every student in the front row knew exactly who had written them. "This," she said, her voice carrying through the hall, "is what they gave me. They called me names, mocked my family, told me to know my place. They thought these words would break me, but what they didn't realize is that they handed me the very proof I needed." She pointed to her equations. Resilience isn't theoretical. It's survival in the face of voices like these. This problem wasn't solved in spite of their cruelty. It was solved because I understood it in a way they never could. The room fell silent. Some faculty exchanged stunned looks. Professor Wright, seated near the front, leaned forward with pride shining in his eyes. One of the legacy boys in the front row shot to his feet. His face red. "This is outrageous," he shouted. "You can't use..." But his protest was drowned out by the wave of murmurs spreading through the hall. The words on the board spoke louder than his outrage. They weren't just insults anymore. They were evidence of a system built on arrogance and exclusion. When Kesha finished, there was no hesitation. The room erupted into applause, louder, longer than before. Professors stood, scholars nodded. Even students who had never spoken to her clapped until their palms burned. The best students sat frozen, their arrogance collapsing under the weight of their own words. For once, they had nothing left to say. Kesha stepped away from the podium, her notebook pressed against her chest. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She simply walked off the stage with quiet dignity, the thunder of applause trailing behind her. She hadn't just solved the impossible problem. She had exposed the ugliness that had tried to keep her invisible, and Harvard would never forget it. The days that followed were unlike anything Harvard had seen in years. Newspapers picked up the story almost immediately. Scholarship student solves impossible problem. Headlines ricocheted from campus blogs to national outlets, and before long, Kesha Monroe's name was being spoken in academic circles far beyond Cambridge. But inside Harvard's ancient brick walls, something deeper was stirring. Professor Williams, who had once introduced the problem with a smirk that dared anyone to even try, was silent for days after the symposium. When he finally addressed the class, his tone had shifted. He didn't apologize directly, men like him rarely did, but his clipped voice carried something that sounded suspiciously like respect. "Miss Monroe has demonstrated what this institution often forgets," he said, his hand tightening on the podium. "Genius does not belong to pedigree, it belongs to perspective, and today, perspective belongs to her." Gaw. SPS swept through the room. Some students turned to stare at Kesha, their eyes no longer sharp with cruelty, but wide with something else. Curiosity, maybe even admiration. Still, the wounds she carried weren't easily erased. The cruel messages, the humiliation, the whispers, those scars remained. But scars, Kesha knew, were proof of survival. 1 week later, Harvard convened a special board session. Professors, deans, and alumni gathered in a high-ceilinged chamber, portraits of old white men watching from the walls. Kesha sat at the long mahogany table, her notebook before her, Professor Wright seated quietly at her side. The dean leaned forward. "Miss Monroe, your model has been reviewed by our mathematics and economics departments. Its implications are extraordinary. We'd like to propose publication, not just in the Harvard Journal, but in a joint international review." Kesha's heart pounded, but she kept her voice steady. "I'll agree to publication, but only if my work is credited as more than an academic exercise. This isn't just theory, it's lived reality. And I want this university to commit to expanding opportunities for students from backgrounds like mine, not just in words, but in structure." The room shifted uneasily. A few professors whispered. The dean frowned. "That's ambitious." Professor Wright spoke then, his voice firm. "Ambition is the only reason we're here. She solved what you all believed unsolvable. The least this institution can do is honor her terms." Silence stretched. Then slowly the dean nodded. "Very well. The Kesha Protocol will be established, a program to recruit and support underrepresented voices in advanced research." Her chest tightened. The Kesha Protocol. The name sounded unreal, almost too large for her shoulder. She was a symbol. Students sought her out, not to mock, but to learn. Reporters chased her down corridors. Professors invited her to guest lectures. But Kesha remained grounded. Every night she still called her mother, who laughed softly through the phone. "Baby, they're saying your name on TV. Can you believe that?" "My daughter." And every morning she walked across the yard with her same old backpack, her sneakers still worn, her sweater still frayed. She didn't need new things to prove she belonged. Her presence was proof enough. The best students faded into the background. Some transferred their arrogance into silence. Others tried awkward apologies. But Kesha didn't waste her energy on them. She had already turned their cruelty into fuel, into equations, into a legacy. One late evening, months later, she stood again in the library where her breakthrough had been born. The same lamp glowed, the same silence stretched. She touched the edge of the table, remembering the tears, the doubt, the moment she whispered resilience into the dark. Now her notebook was filled not just with equations, but with letters from students around the world, young people who had read her published paper and written to say, "You made me believe I could belong too." Kesha smiled softly, closing her eyes. The impossible problem had been more than math. It had been her life, and she had solved it, line by line, scar by scar, breath by breath. Her mother's words returned, steady and sure. "They don't know what you carry." Now the world did, and Harvard would never be the same.